All right, well, there we go. Now it's recording. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Alabama Virtual Advocacy Day. My name is Andrew Colson. I serve as the one of the co-chairs for our Government Relations Committee for the state of Alabama. I'm also joined by Miss Megan Rolfe from Winthrop University, who is also joining us as Government Relations SACAC chair. We'll get into introductions here in just a little bit, but I just wanted to once again thank you guys so much for joining us today. Quick little overview of our schedule before we get into introductions. Since we do have a smaller group, I did want to just make sure we were all aware of who is here, because I know we have some new people to the higher education field who are joining us today. Then of course some people who are not so new, but I just want to make sure we spend a little bit of time networking, as is always fun with these type of events. So just a quick overview of today's agenda. Like I said, I did want to start out with introductions. We also have Katie Morgan from Auburn University, who represents state and area initiatives with SACAC, to just give a quick little overview about state and area initiatives, since we do a lot of partnerships and a lot of bleed over between our different committees here. And so I just wanted to thank her once again for joining us and giving us that breakdown. Also, so how today is being split up. So it's basically a 3-tiered type of thing. I wanted to start out today for this first hour to focus on just kind of a frank conversation about how higher education and changes in higher education specifically have affected representatives from our high school partners, as well as our colleges, especially in the aftermath of COVID. And this will cover a couple different topics, ranging from communication, how that has changed, testing policies and admissions policies, how those have affected students, how those have affected counselors, how those have affected colleges, and of course, staffing, as we have seen major shortages in staffing and the Great Resignation, how that might have affected your side of things, whatever that might be, high school or college side. And then we also have 2 guest speakers joining us today. So David Hawkins, who's the Chief Education Policy Officer with NACAC, will be joining us for a national policy and NACAC legislative agenda overview at the 10 o'clock hour. And then finishing us off is Representative Terry Collins from Alabama State House. She's also the chair of the Education Policy Committee. And so she'll be giving us kind of an overview of Alabama education policy. If you've been keeping up with anything like that, one of her big initiatives right now is the Literacy Act, currently in debate, or rather in the legislative session, that could potentially become official for the 2023-2024 academic year. And so she'll be giving us some updates on that. You will note that this is set to take place from 9 to 12 in totality. However, Representative Collins let me know that, well, since we are in the middle of legislative session, she will have to leave at 11:15 a.m. Central Time. And so we will convene, or rather not convene, but we will adjourn our meeting as soon as she is done. So I'll give you a little bit of your time back here today, but thank you so much again for joining us regardless. Now, in order to actually make sure we can all see each other, I do request, if you are able to do so, please make sure to have your video on, and of course, when you're speaking, have your microphone on as well. I wanted to just kind of quickly start with introductions of everybody, just so that way, once again, we're a smaller group here, so that way we all know who's in attendance, where you're coming from. And so I'll just kind of call you out instead of just popcorning, because nobody knows what order they're in, because everyone has a different order here. So Bailey, we'll go ahead and start with you, actually, if you could just tell us your name and, obviously what organization you represent.
All right. Well, hey, y'all. My name is Bailey Drummond. I am at UAB with Andrew and Tyler and Heather. I'm an admissions counselor, primarily serving South Alabama, as well as a few schools in Jefferson County, which is where Birmingham is.
Awesome. And then Oliver, you're next on my list.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see your faces. I'm Oliver Aaron, college counselor at Vestavia Hills High School in Birmingham.
Awesome. Great. And then Tyler, you're next on my list.
Hey, y'all. Tyler Peterson with UAB, also serving as SACAC president this year.
Yeah. So we brought in heavy hitters for this one as well. So, so we got Whitney next.
Hey, I'm Whitney Volts. I am one of 2 college advisors at Mountain Brook High School in Birmingham, Alabama.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. And I believe Laodicea, is that right?
Yes, that is. Good morning, everyone. I'm Laodicea, and I'm the manager of transfer student recruitment here at Auburn.
Laodicea. All right. Great to meet you. Great to meet you. And then Heather.
Good morning, everybody. Heather Robinson Lauer. I'm a regional recruiter based in North Alabama, and both of my bosses are on this call. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be with new colleagues and with Bailey as well.
Awesome. Great. And then Katie, you're on my list as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Morgan. I am an admissions advisor at Auburn University, currently coming to you live from St. Louis. I'm attending the American College Personnel Association conference. So as I talked to Andrew and Megan earlier, the bright light that is very yellow is from a hotel lamp. But anyway, working at Auburn for a few years now and here in another capacity as the state chair. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Great. And Megan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Rolfe. I'm the Director of Recruitment at Winthrop University in South Carolina. I'm also in my 3rd year serving on SACAC's Board of Directors for Government Relations.
Great. Awesome. Well, it is good to have you all here. Like I said, we will have a couple other people who might be joining us a bit later who've sent me a message here. But I'm glad that you all were able to sign on at 9 o'clock. And so I don't think I actually really introduced myself and what I do. Outside of being co-chair of government relations for the state of Alabama, I am also the associate director of in-state recruitment for the University of Alabama at Birmingham, in case you didn't already know me. So it's good to see everyone here today. So I wanted to quickly go over, in case you weren't aware, because like I said, we do have a couple of people who are new to the profession on this call. Government relations, in case you didn't know, just SACAC kind of oversees a good chunk of the southeastern United States when it comes to our profession in higher education, providing a lot of advice, advisement, and of course, guidance when it comes to anything from college fairs to news about the state of higher education in the region, as well as nationally speaking. But then, of course, we have subcommittees within that as well. And so government relations is one of those. And I think the website says it best. I mean, our duty is to inform members of issues of concern with regards to education and college access initiatives at the state and national level. And so our role in government relations is to provide that bridge between yourself as professionals who are on the ground working with students, with our legislators, and just kind of keeping a finger on the pulse of our profession. And so I had Megan scheduled to actually give us a little bit more of a higher level overview as well, since she oversees kind of the entirety of SACAC and advises a couple other states besides Alabama too. So Megan, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm really excited to be here with everyone today, and I really appreciate everyone taking time out of your schedule. I know March is so busy, but the work that we do is so important. So I do just want to kind of take a few minutes to kind of go over, what government relations is and how we can continue to advocate, beyond this morning and today. So when I was kind of thinking about this, what always comes back to me is years ago when I first got started in this profession myself, I asked a mentor of mine, I said, how can I get more involved and make a bigger impact? And he said to me, the best way is to get started in your own backyard. And that has always stuck with me. And for me, at that time, I did not know it would lead to advocacy work. I started as a state chair like Andrew, but I do believe that it is the best way to influence change. And as Andrew was just saying, SACAC really works with NACAC in support of NACAC's pillar priorities. And I think that everyone here in our profession, we are called to do this work because we feel passionately about NACAC's priorities, at least one of them, if not all of them. And those include access to rigorous curriculum, Anybody who works with students knows that there's inequities for high-level coursework in high schools. Not all students have access to college-level courses like AP and IB and dual enrollment, and so we really support students having equal opportunity to those type of courses and to be prepared for entering into college. We also support need-based financial aid. Again, we all know that affordability is the largest barrier to attending college. So we support access to grants, investing in grants, fully funding things like the Pell Grant. I think that across the board, that's something that everybody gets behind. We also want to protect our students from unethical recruitment practices. We don't want students to be coerced into attending colleges or deceived. We definitely don't want them to be put in positions where they're defaulting on loans later because they were misled. So that's something that we really support, and that's again in support with SACAC and their pillar priorities. We also support undocumented students. Tens of thousands of undocumented students are graduating from high school every year. They don't qualify for institutional aid. We definitely don't want to see them being hung out to dry. We want, legislation to be enacted so that they, have a pathway, to higher education. We also support student mobility. We want essentially more international students to come to the US so that we can globalize our society. We can provide more cultural opportunities and enrich our own universities, but also it helps our economy. And then finally, we support school counselors and college advising. We know that our students need access to their school counselors for mentorship, for advisement, for help and encouragement, for navigating the college application process. I have a high school senior myself, and I've been in college admissions a really long time, and it's a lot more confusing than I even expected it to be. Everybody's deadlines are different. Everybody has different requirements on the application. And so students who don't have a support system from home, if they're first generation, even if they did have one parent who went to college, like they need support, they need guidance to help them, meet those deadlines and, make sure they're making the right decisions. And, in Alabama, the counselor to student ratios are not manageable, and they're definitely not in compliance. The last I checked, it was 450 to 1, which is, I think the national, like what we would like to see is like 1 to 300, so that's definitely way off. And with, shortages and with people leaving the profession, it's not getting any better. So, that's something that we know our students need. We know that counselors and advisors need additional support there. And then, I know Andrew's going to get into this a little bit later, but then you have the whole mental health situation on top of that, in addition to that. So, I think that in our profession, again, we all feel passionately about these efforts. So I really appreciate Andrew putting this program together today, so that we can continue this type of work in Alabama and in SACAC. Because as he mentioned before, he, as serving as our state government relations chair, is charged with promoting this type of work in Alabama. But, there's a kind of a whole committee, everybody here today. That's the first step to kind of, again, influencing change, and making sure that, we see progress in these areas and in our own profession and for our students that we serve. So, we're always looking for folks to attend these events, to volunteer, to get more involved in advocacy work. And there's lots of ways that you can continue beyond today. And so I want you to kind of keep some of these things in mind as you kind of listen and learn throughout today's program, connecting with your elected officials. You can call them, you can email them, you can schedule meetings that, that you are their constituents, so they can certainly meet with you at any time. Work on building those relationships with your local and state decision makers. They, typically live in your neighborhoods. They might have students who go to your schools. They might have a business that you frequent. So, these are folks that might attend your church. So building those relationships with them, attend their open forums, maybe tag them on social media, follow them on social media, or attend other nonpartisan sites. So that you're kind of following some of these issues. If you're so inclined, maybe write an op-ed or a blog or a letter to the editor. But something that we've seen a lot of traction on, particularly during the pandemic in some of our states, is action alerts. And we've had a lot of our members that, across SACAC who have really been influential in creating these action alerts with the help of government relations. And it starts on the state level. In North Carolina last year, we did an action alert for test optional policy for the state system schools, like all the North Carolina system schools. And I mean, it influenced the lawmakers and they passed it and they went test optional, but it all started with the action alerts and with the advocacy work of the individuals through government relations and through SACAC, spreading the word and, telling their stories that, with the work that they do with their students each and every day and how they're being impacted by not being able to get into testing centers and, how it's impacting the scholarships they receive and so on. Georgia has been working for years on getting need-based aid. Georgia is one of very few states that does not offer need-based aid to their students. And again, they've gotten thousands of signatures through action alerts, and now they're having one-on-one meetings with these legislators and decision makers, and they're seeing movement. It's definitely gaining traction because it's something that's easy to get behind is promoting need-based aid. So there's lots of different ways that are easy that you can do from the comfort of your home to really kind of get the ball rolling. So I just want you to kind of keep those things in mind. We really want you to stay involved and continue this work, again, for your profession, for our students, because it really does make a difference. And we've seen that across all of our states. So again, thank you for having me. And thank you so much, Andrew, for putting together such a great schedule.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Megan. Well, and I appreciate that very great overview too. I think that really kind of puts into context as to what we're trying to do here today. And of course, what we hope you to take away from at the end of the day today and continue to be involved with this work, both as it relates to this committee, and then of course, just as it relates to the profession in general and advocating for our students, because at the end of the day, that is one of the things we really want to do is advocate for our students, advocate for our colleagues, for the betterment of the profession and betterment of our society. And so in kind of focusing on that, a lot of that comes with a sense of initiative, and who better to talk about initiatives than Katie Morgan. And so I also wanted Katie, like I said, we do a lot of overlap with state and area initiatives. Each state within SACAC does have a state and area initiatives committee as well. And so I wanted Katie just kind of give a quick little overview in case you were not aware of anything that's currently in the pipeline for them. And of course, just kind of an overview of what they do as well. So Katie, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome intro and segue, Andrew. I appreciate that. And I would be remiss to say not mention I can't talk today. My point, what I'm trying to say in this awful intro is that it's really been a pleasure working with Andrew this year. And we had a state meeting that was virtual in the fall, I believe, because time is a crazy concept. And it's just really appreciate everybody that showed up there. That appreciate all of you for showing up here and doing the work every day and also on this call. And as I was thinking of things to mention, it seemed I wanted to frame myself in the mission of SACAC. And so kind of starting broadly, and we've hit on one of the words a lot already today, but just keywords in that mission statement about college counseling professionals on both sides of the desk, if you will, working together to promote ethical responsibility, professional growth, access, advocacy, and outreach to help all students achieve their educational goals. And so again, I appreciate all of you for the work that you do every day and showing up every day for your students and for yourself and your staff and your fellow staff members and showing up to do this work today. And so when it comes to state and area initiatives, as Andrew alluded to already, it's definitely a collaborative effort across the state and then SACAC more broadly. There's lots of ways to get involved if you are interested. Speaking of the state meeting, the one that we had in the fall was awesome. I'm so grateful for how that went. And we'll also have one at the SACAC conference next month because that will be in April. But things that are coming most quickly regarding the state is we have our drive-in. It's virtual, and my colleague at Auburn, Ryan Cole, is the coordinator for the drive-in, and I'm really really excited about that. I actually had a goal to drop this in the chat if anybody's interested in being there. This is the registration link if you would like to be there. Primarily geared towards those on the college counseling side of things. You'd also receive a continuing education credit if you're interested in that, but I'll be there. Other admissions folks will be there if you're interested. And so this is a great way to kind of learn more about how to support students, underrepresented, historically excluded students, even learning FAFSA, which quite frankly, I need to learn more about. And so I'm excited about that session. There will also be a panel. So if you want to engage with that, it's quite literally this time next week, and registration is still open. More broadly, I will just generally always hype all things SACAC communication because I appreciate it and respect it. And the What's Coming Wednesday emails are so very helpful to me. And I'm actually looking at the one from most recently, just as an FYI of things that are coming down the pipeline, again, for ways for you to get engaged with all initiatives across SACAC. And so things that are happening, there is a webinar tomorrow about grants. If you're interested in learning more about writing grants, there's one next week, a webinar about what to get most out of the SACAC conference. Speaking of, mentioned it already, that conference is happening in Orlando, April 3rd through 5th. And if you want to register, quickly approaching that deadline, it's next Friday, March the 18th, I believe, if I know my calendar correctly, but it's next Friday is the deadline to register for the conference if you're interested in that. And then one that I'm also really excited about and always excited about is the Inclusion Access and Success Book Club is coming back. They're a meeting on Thursday, March 31st, 7 p.m. Eastern time, so 6 p.m. our time in the state of Alabama. And they are going to be reading and talking about Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers book. So if you're interested in that and engaging in that initiative, that's an opportunity for you too. And so, yeah, if there's anything that I can do to support your goals in engaging with SACAC, supporting your students, and again, your work that you do in whatever capacity, please let me know. But really grateful to be here for the next few minutes. I'll have to duck out, have a presentation, but so glad to be here. And again, thank you so much for all the work that all of you do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much, Katie. And as far as Malcolm Gladwell's book goes, I mean, I am always terrified to talk to strangers, so I definitely picked the wrong profession here. But that sounds like something I personally would be very interested in. So thanks for all those plugs. And really excited about the drive-in. I actually had a chance to attend Tennessee's SAI drive-in last week, and that was just really interesting for me, even though that was once again forward focusing more towards our college counselors. Still just very interesting to kind of get that perspective. Speaking of perspective, I'm really going off of these transitions here. Speaking of perspective, like I said, what I really wanted us to focus on this first hour was more of a discussion. And so I really want to kind of hone in and hear y'all's voices as it pertains to things you have noticed that have happened over this past year, or rather these past few years, as it pertains to the massive seismic changes we have seen in the realm of higher education since the dawn of COVID, and even prior to that with Varsity Blues, has been a rather transitionary period for our profession here within just the last 5 or so years. And a lot of that is both related to things outside of our control, within our control as well. And so obviously we have a lot of things happening around our state. For example, most of our campuses have relaxed their COVID protocols and mask mandates for one. And of course, we had our free application week that was supported by AIC that happened last week as well. And then a lot of different legislation, both affecting directly higher education and of course, maybe not so directly, still within the realm of our, higher education as well. Like I said, though, I really wanted to focus this discussion on kind of 4 different things, kind of communication and how you feel that has gone in between colleges and high schools, and how we can better create a better sense of communication between our students, our high school staff, and our college staff, and then testing kind of different policies that are involved with testing as when it comes to test optional policies changing, admissions policies changing, as well as even kind of larger seismic shifts such as SAT switching to a virtual format here in the next year or so. And then also focusing on things like staffing as it has affected the staffing shortages, how it has affected both high school as well as college level. And then finally, just kind of mental health. So that is a big one. And I really want to start with. And like I said, this is a group discussion. And so I'll leave this topic slide up here real quick before I turn it off so that way we can see each other's faces. But I really wanted to kind of just start off our conversation. So one thing that I personally, as well as have heard back from fellow colleagues as well, have noticed has been a major concern about student mental health in light of the COVID epidemic, whether it be through a sense of isolation that year and a half of actual, whether it be isolation or quarantine caused for these students, the learning loss that went along with that, as well as just the difficulty in communication, and how you're seeing that affect your current seniors as they go into this final college selection process. And so I'm just curious to kind of start us off here. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen here. I'd like to just kind of hear from you all on how the state of mental health for your students has either changed compared to what you've seen in past years. And obviously I am gearing this a lot towards our college, high school counselors to kind of give us some insight first, but also how that has possibly changed you all's perspective on this whole process when it comes to dealing with the admissions world. And so if anybody would like to go ahead and kind of just give us kind of their perspective on what they've seen as far as any kind of shifts in collective mental health, I'd be glad to hear that.
Andrew, we saw I saw a presentation last week from our counseling director, and I'm trying to find the actual statistic, but the increase in students that they saw over the past year, I believe it was like a 29% increase from the year before. And then compared, and that was only compared to 2020. I didn't even see what the comparison was from, let's say, 2019 to 2020. But I thought even just in a year that may have been somewhat familiar, that was a real big increase from the past year.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know personally, I kind of, prior to my current role, I worked with a group called Birmingham Promise here on campus, working primarily with our freshmen within that cohort. And one thing that was a consistent concern for these students as we did polling was just on the availability of mental health resources, and of course just struggles with things both at home as well as at school, and kind of dealing with the stress, especially in the fall of 2020 and spring of 2021, that online schooling brought in light of the pandemic. And so I know stress has been a major factor for current students here at UAB specifically, but also in just speaking with our applicants this year, definitely noticed a good chunk of students, maybe it's just me being a little bit more sensitive to it, but definitely an increase in anxiety about the whole process of admissions, for sure. And like I said, I'd be interested if any of our high school counselors had any kind of insight as to, what they've seen with their students here, or parents too. Once again, I'm not a parent, so I don't have that perspective, but I'd be interested to hear that as well.
Just graduate. Oh.
We can hear you now.
It's these AirPods, I can never tell.
Hey, Oliver and Whitney, are y'all seeing an increase in just the services you all are needing to provide? Maybe not you specifically, but in your high schools and then in thinking about preparedness when they come to us, how big of a factor is that when students are sort of looking at college? You know, how many of your students or parents are asking about, you know, those support services?
I guess more broadly, kind of, we have our setup at our school. For those of you who don't know, we've got 2 college advisors, but then we have grade level counselors. So we're a little bit not intentionally separated, but and we have construction going on in our school. So like physically we are separated. So we are not as privy to some of that right now as we have been in the past, and we will be in the future. So I'll preface with that. But I do feel like in terms of, I mean, my observation is, and I worked in a school counseling role before doing this. So I kind of naturally try to de-stress situations anyway. But I do feel like there's a lot of, as far as like, you know, they went from, you know, our students, we still held them accountable during COVID and all of that, but it was different as it was for all of us. And so I feel like they've kind of gone from, you know, a little bit more loosey-goosey to back in the classroom. And we've been in the classroom for the majority of the time, but just, I'm seeing we're having to handhold a lot more just in terms of our process and kind of what we ask for them to do. And we're okay with that. We know that's where everybody is right now, but it does worry you as they kind of go off and they're on their own. So, so just kind of as a department, we're trying to kind of almost wean off like you would as a parent, but and try to help teach some of that. But yeah, we're seeing some of that is just in terms of, I think, a switch from a lot of hand holding at one point and kind of moving back away from that. And sometimes that's tougher for some to deal with, you know, parents and students.
This observation is a little bit more informal, but I was just kind of rattling through conversations in my head as we thought about this. My son, who is 3, has been speech delayed actually in all of this. We have rounded the corner, and now I'm one of those parents that am finding myself with the tendency to want to say shh, and I'm like, no, we've paid too much money and put too much energy and effort into speech therapy for me to tell him to be quiet in any capacity. But anyway, those conversations that I had with the pediatrician, you know, my pediatrician, when COVID started, it was like, just keep your children safe and we'll worry about the rest, the social development and the rest of this later, which that was at the beginning, you know, when we were just trying to safeguard health at all cost. But he mentioned in that conversation, he said, I'm seeing the craziest things in this practice. And he said he had seen a huge uptick in ages from like 8 to 12 experiencing anxiety and had never seen those sorts of experiences in his practices before. And then this on the other side of the spectrum in dealing with high school students in recruitment, I can't really piece this together entirely yet, but I'm noticing, I think maybe sort of a pattern of withdrawal with students. And I'm sort of seeing this in the increase for exemptions and housing requests, like the hesitancy to want to live on campus. And what I'm seeing students doing, I think, is using COVID as sort of a justification, maybe that they hope that can kind of pass the mustard, if you will, on their housing exemption form. But I actually am not certain it's even fear of COVID. I think it's just this maybe pattern that we've been in, that we've withdrawn and we've isolated for so long that, I don't know, I find this even in myself. I don't know if we have sort of lost that quality to be able to immerse ourselves in amongst other people in social groups. I don't know if it's still crippling fear of being sick. I don't know if students have been stunted in some sort of really significant way that we're going to see long-term consequences of. But, you know, I even ran into a young lady within my hometown who is a current college student at Jacksonville State, actually. And they've resumed normalcy. And I just was in conversations with her. She was still wanting to be at home, wanting to take online classes, and is working in a little local gift shop here, which is great and wonderful. But it just really caught me off guard, because when she graduated high school, it was a very social young woman. I knew she was going to take her academics seriously, but she was also one of those students that was wanting sort of a social experiment or experience in a post-secondary institution. So it just caught me off guard to see her negating that aspect of college. I don't know. Those are not, very articulate observations on what's happening, and I'm not sure what to make of it. I even filled out a survey for NACAC, our national regional group, yesterday. They put together a big survey every year. Those of you that are regionals know about that. And a lot of the questions were asking us to articulate what we felt were the significant ramifications in our position and with students with COVID. And I found myself not being able to articulate. I found myself typing, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing. And I know that my job and my role as a regional recruiter has changed, but I'm not sure that I can even tell you what it is now that I do differently, or what the profile of the student is that's different. And of course, as a mother, I worry about this with my 1-year-old and my 3-year-old as well, like what this might have done or be doing to them. So pontifications that I can sort out at a later time. I guess I'll mute now.
I can speak to my daughter. She's a senior, and she's headed to a big university next year. She is desperate to get in a single room. They have the apartment style. That's what everybody seems to want on social media. She wants a single room in case she's stressed out or has anxiety and she doesn't want to be around her other roommates. I think anybody who knows her would think that she's very social and outgoing, but she does have a lot of anxiety. Her sophomore year was the beginning of COVID. So she spent they all went home in March. Then junior year, they were on an AB schedule where they only went to school about 2 days a week for most of the year. And now she's a senior and she only has 2 classes. She has study hall, which they put her in, and 1 dual enrollment class. That's it. And that's all she has, at school. She's graduating with probably 36 hours of AP and college credit. She's just kind of showing up 1 hour a day, for this 1 class, but they're not very good at making plans. They're on their phones all day. They don't really know what to do with themselves. They go out and take pictures for social media and make it look like they're in the city and doing these cool things, but then they come home. It's very different from when I was a kid and would do anything to not be home. It's this kind of mirage, I think, for a lot of these kids. It's more this social media personality that they have than this actual social personality. She's very stressed about finding roommates in college. She was stressed that she'd have to find them for orientation. She didn't know if they would, she had to find that too. That really gave her some, I've had to talk to my staff about that. These kids just they're stressed about all of it. So I do think that there is a lot of that. I kind of call them the COVID kids, they're just used to being home on their phones. So I don't know. I think we're going to see more of that, with these younger generations.
Isn't that
on that side too, though? This is just weird. I hired my first counselor a few years ago who had never used a desktop phone in his life. We actually had to do a full training for that. He'd never had a real standard phone. My youngest daughter does it, she has a cell phone, but she only FaceTimes people. So whenever I give her the phone, talk to your dad, she holds it away from her face. And I'm always put it to your ear. So I just think that whole virtual, we're going to be changing the way we do things. It's going to be a lot more virtual chatting,
That does remind me. So I was in a session yesterday. It was like a research paper, a research in progress. So it means that it's actually one of the things I'm going to be presenting on later this afternoon. But it's that a manuscript's in process, but is not quite ready for publication. And I say all of that because the presenter was talking about different generations and a multi-generational workforce and what that looks like when you have an office that has all the way maybe from baby boomers to Gen Z and the interactions and whatnot. And this just reminds me because I learned a new word, and I will drop a link. To be very clear, I have not read the title or have not read this article, so it could be absolute trash. So just there, but there's this word called phygital for Gen Z, and it's FIGITAL. And it's the idea that the combination between physical life and digital life, there is no disconnect, that Gen Z is living both in a physical space as well as a digital space, and it is the same thing. So I just wanted to offer that. I haven't done any research beyond that, but it sounds like what we are working towards and speaking of right now. So just a fun little passing it on, because that was a new thing that I learned. And I also wanted to offer, I was in a different session. The title was Advising and Supporting in Student Affairs, a Critical Self-Awareness Approach. And the only thing that I'll offer here was they talked about trauma stewardship, and this may be something that other folks are familiar with, but it was new to me. And there is a book that I'll just drop a link to as well. Again, I haven't read it, but I'm very interested in just the title alone. It's Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self while also caring for others. And that felt very relevant to the work that we do on a day-to-day basis, and not to steer the conversation off of this path, but also thinking about care for ourselves as we're caring for others, both on the college and high school side. I mean, I'm thinking about final decisions releasing at Auburn last Friday for the fall 2022 class, and what that means for making sure that we're being thoughtful and talking to students and caring for them on our side of things and our role, while also taking care of ourselves. And that's just a small little nugget. So other folks may be aware of that, but wanted to offer that up because it's something that I may be looking into as well. So thoughts there.
Yeah, Tyler, you're talking about what are we seeing on our side, and at Vestavia, very similar to Mount Brook, where Whitney is and Karen is. We're just seeing more anxiety for our students. They're coming in. Our setup is kind of the same. Two college counselors. We're here with our grade level counselors, and it's not just with the senior class, it's with the underclassmen as well. And I look forward to working with them, but I just kind of want to be like, hey guys, chill out. Enjoy sophomore, junior year. Make really good grades now. Take classes that are appropriate for you. Make an A in those. Be involved. Enjoy life. You're not trapped in your rooms at home anymore. It's not March of 2020. I don't know whether to tell them we're in a pandemic still or not. I don't know. I don't have a mask on. They don't have a mask on. I can see their face, which is really nice again. I think it's nice for them. But as Megan was saying, yeah, they're walking down the halls with their head in their phone. That's not going to change. We've got to find ways to continue to communicate with them, both at the high school side and the college side. So that's a challenge for both. Our students, Tyler, I think you were leading toward this. With the pandemic, are our students going to be prepared for their 4-year institution or their 2-year school? That's my concern. I think that we had to be, well, maybe we didn't have to be. Our administration chose to. We were so lenient and gave them extensions on the high school side. And colleges probably did too, about, okay, extensions, maybe we say that's grace, and we're giving students more grace as well. But that's not going to happen. In the fall, when they enter their freshman year, a professor's deadline is a professor's deadline. And that's what we've been trying to talk to students in this 7th semester since we've been back, that when a professor gives you a deadline, guys, you've got to get it turned in. I don't know if we approach that the best of the high school, that because we would give them 2 or 3 or 4 more weeks to get something turned in, and they had all the time in the world. So I don't know. I'm worried about them being prepared. I'm interested to see feedback reports that we get from our schools where we send a lot of students, how they did their freshman year. And again, the anxiety about picking out a roommate, the anxiety of sorority recruitment, housing. When am I going to get to pick my classes? Well, a lot of you aren't going to get your classes till we get back your, you go to orientation, and then that's going to change because your AP tests results that come back in July they could change the classes that you signed up for in June at orientation. So there's 2 cents.
Well, and
To Heather's, to Heather's point though too, like for the first time, we have parent Facebooks, and we're seeing parents posting, like they're going on our social calendars at Winthrop, and they're posting what's going on for other parents to tell their kids who go here. Like we talk about in our office, like it's really weird. Like their kids are in their rooms and can't figure out like all the stuff that's going on. So the parents are doing this and then posting it in the parent Facebook groups. Like that's a new thing.
Yeah, and maybe I don't know, for me, maybe more as a parent or recruiter, but I think one of the most concerning things that we hear in all of this is not just that the students have morphed to become these like different creatures, this different generation, right? That like they're on their phones or they're scared to engage, but it's like this bifurcation that they're doing those things. But like Megan, what you were talking about, that your child still has this impulse to like go somewhere and document, but it's not real. Like there's this consciousness in them that says, oh, I should be doing these things, or like I'm forced to live in a dorm, so I've got to live in a dorm, but I've got to be able to retreat. I don't know. I think that's more concerning for me than anything. Not that they've become a different generation, but they still feel this impulse to do, but then there's something on the emotional or social side that won't allow them to do it. And then maybe we are doing for them because they can't do it in ways that maybe is not helpful. I don't know. I mean, I'm as COVID paranoid as they come. I'm preaching to myself in a lot of this because my dad even said to me, like, you're going to have to rejoin here. Like life has come on, I know your children were young and you were pregnant and all that, but you've got to kind of step back into the light too. So I don't know. It's worrisome.
I think I've talked a lot about with students is being uncomfortable is okay. And I know that looks different because I have young kids. So like it looks different all, across the board. But I think because we all experience something so impactful, but as the adults in the scenario, we have to push to discomfort. And I don't mean like excruciating discomfort. I just mean you can't grow if you're comfortable all the time, I believe. So pushing to be a little bit uncomfortable is okay. And I think parents have to get right with that again and remember that they're and I don't mean to be preachy because I it's the same. I'm saying this to myself too, is but discomfort's okay. And that's how you grow and you learn about yourself. Otherwise, we're going to remain the same people that we left off with the pandemic. You know what I'm saying? And that's not the person I want to be. So I Heather, what you just said is like, maybe we're filling in for those gaps instead of letting some of those gaps speak for themselves. I think there's so much of that. We're trying so hard to help them, but it may be more of we may be getting to the point of enabling. And that's something here that we're like, anyway, kind of a balance of helping, but also how is it best how are these kids, how are they going to learn? And I mean, like on a really personal level, like you have to, sometimes you have to make mistakes or you have to feel something in order to learn. Not that I want anybody to be hurt or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying a little discomfort. You learn something about yourselves.
Well, and I think that's, a perfect analogy is a good workout will make you feel sore after the fact, but a bad workout will obviously break your bones. So we definitely don't want to do that, but we definitely want to feel sore after the fact. One thing, this conversation has kind of got my wheels turning and kind of thinking back on the drive-in I attended last week. A counselor mentioned, as far as communication goes between colleges and students, is the fact that colleges are not always necessarily meeting a student where they are at. And I assume that can probably just kind of cover the entirety of anybody interacting with a high school student. So the medium of communication has changed over these past two years or so. And, people have definitely, students have been far more comfortable with that virtual conferencing. Those one-on-one conversations just statistically have shown to be more engaging to a student rather than just rote email communication. And I know personally, for myself, I am very reliant on email, and that's something I've personally had to train myself out of as well. And so I'm curious to kind of hear just y'all's kind of feedback on that too. Are we meeting students where we need to, as far as communicating with them and talking to them about these learning curves as they go into this admissions process?
I think so.
Perfect. Great. And I think it does. I think it does depend on who you're talking to. And of course, if you're talking to a college counselor versus a school or not a school, excuse me, a university / college. One thing that I know I've gotten a lot of feedback from counselors is the fact that, it definitely helps to have those in-person meetings when possible. COVID, when schools were starting to pull back from those COVID protocols, UAB personally was a school we just, as of last week, did away with our mandate for masks. And so we've been a little bit more conservative on that end, which has been both beneficial to some, and then of course, a little bit, for lack of a better word, stodgy to others in that personal communication. You can argue that either which way. And so I'm glad to hear kind of what y'all's feedback has been on this, just because it does sound like a lot of the anxiety that is coming from these students is from obviously a lack of exposure to normality over the past 2 years, but also just an unfamiliarity with not only the admissions process, but just kind of these type of conversations between schools about, reviewing your own academic profile and putting that into context of the admissions process. Any thoughts, concerns on that, or really, I know we only have 3 minutes until we go into our next session here, but as far as the policies and how they've changed too, and how schools have communicated that, whether it be test optional, some schools on this very, very call right here going test optional in these past 2 years, how has that been for students you've interacted with?
I feel like I came into this call thinking I was never going to talk and just keep talking, so I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But I was going to say the only thing, and I know I don't want this to be rude, but we get so many emails, and I feel like it's gotten better over the past year, but like, I can only imagine the kids hardly check their emails anyway. And when they get so many, whatever that effect is, they're just numb to them. So that's why I just quickly said, I feel like you are, but at the same time, and I'm not going to call any colleges out in particular, because I don't know who to say for sure, but there's just so many emails. So I don't know if they become more important when there are fewer to them, or maybe they have to go look at the website because they're not getting emails. I'm not saying you're going to stop sending emails, but just some thoughts.
I think to Whitney's point, there's a lot of There are a lot of emails for us and the student. I think there's some miscommunication that, and you just brought up test optional. So talking about being a test optional school, and a lot of schools are, more than half of the students in this application cycle are applying test optional, and that's great. I'm definitely for putting ACT out of business. But, and SAT, leave College Board out. But I don't think some schools are being as transparent with those applicants about accepting, being the admissions rate. We got some information from a mass email from an institution that was pro test optional for applicants, and the admission, they weren't admitting those students, and that's kind of aggravating because we get the information in the summer. We're a test optional institution, okay, and we're told it's not going to hurt the applicant. Come to find out, it hurt the applicant, and that's not fair to the student.
Yeah, and I think from a higher ed side, I think it's so dependent on the institution. Like I can speak like at Winthrop, we have, we get audited by our Commission on Higher Education for what GPA and test score we require. So I mean, that's out there, the minimums are out there. But if a student applies test optional, we require a higher GPA. We would tell students that, and for some students that's helpful. If they're not a good test taker, they already have the GPA, that's great. But we've had kids who have good test scores, that apply test optional that would have done better just to send us their scores. So we see this, and I know what you're talking about because having gone through this with my daughter who's a senior, I also had the same questions about scholarships. I know that some schools are reserving their highest scholarships if they submit scores, because they, their board of trustees or whatever think that, kids who have scores should benefit from that. So again, they might say that, it doesn't hurt you, and they might have scholarships for test optional, but it could hurt you if you don't submit those scores, in terms of money. And I had the same issue getting, when I asked, like I have the luxury of working in this profession and knowing some people, but like when I reached out to like a general counselor, I got kind of the runaround answer. And so like I had to reach out specifically to someone I've worked with for 15 years to tell me like straight up like how to apply to their institution. And it's interesting because this institution told me to have my daughter apply test optional, and that's the only school she applied test optional to, and she got in. And someone I know she goes to school with applied with his test scores, and they have almost identical grades and test scores, and he did not. So I'm with you there. There's definitely like a very gray area. And I agree with you, Oliver, in that like the tests they're a barrier, in my opinion. I had to drive my daughter across state lines to get her to take her test during the pandemic. And that's a huge privilege to be able to do that. College Board tried to charge me extra money, even though they canceled our test date, and I had to be on the phone with them to get them to refund that. And to have to pay $15 every school you want to send your scores to. That's why everybody's applying test optional. I mean, it's expensive, it's a pain. Kids don't have any money, and it's their scores. Just doesn't make any sense. I think more schools are going to start accepting unofficial scores.
Thank you, Megan. And in your role on the college side, I wish that there was a push for that, that schools would accept the if you want to say unofficial, from the high school, from the student, self-reported, taking self-reported, a lot of schools, Florida, the student self-reported.
We're going to see a backtrack. Like I'm already hearing the rumors that some schools are going to go back. So it's going to happen. I can tell you, like your schools, like during the pandemic, there were schools that would not let institutions in that were not test optional. So like if we wanted to come visit, if we hadn't announced we were test optional, they would not let us visit their high school. And I say that because what I think a lot of people don't realize is like what most higher ed institutes, like in admissions, BP down, like we all want to be test optional. We get it. We have the data supports that, like we have strong students, like we have all of that. It's the board of trustees, honestly, for most institutions that are like, oh, I don't know, like I think it could make us look like, we're too easy or we're not, highly selective enough or it's these people who sit in these roles that don't do this every day that are the ones who have to be convinced.
Well, and I think that is this kind of discussion is a great kind of transition to our next part. And so I actually had the privilege of listening to a podcast a couple months ago with Mr. David Hawkins, who's joining us now, that he did with SCORE, where he talked about, among many other things, test optional admissions. And so David is joining us now from NACAC. David, are you coming actually from DC?
I am with you live from my wonderful office here at NACAC. You can see it in all its splendor behind me.
Great. Well, David is joining us to give us just kind of an overview of NACAC, as well as just kind of some federal policy updates and everything like that. So David, thank you so much for joining us today. Currently with us right now, we have representatives from obviously state of Alabama, both colleges as well as on the high school side, specifically within the Birmingham metro area. And so we really appreciate you joining us today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share and really look forward to a conversation. I always like doing groups this size because it allows us a lot more time for conversation. So while I do have a PowerPoint now, will I be able to share my screen? Is that cool? Let me see if I can get this all linked up. So while I do have a PowerPoint presentation, I would love to have this be conversational. Before I get started into this, Megan, I also have a daughter who is a senior in high school right now, and she is down to 2. We've narrowed it all down to 2. And my son is older. He's graduating from Gettysburg College this year, so it's my second lap around the track, and I am always amazed at how when I'm, I've been at NACAC for 22 years. I'm always amazed at how confusing I find it. And I think I'm the luckiest parent in America to have, now 26,000 college admission counseling professionals that I can ask for help if I need it. and there are even sometimes when I find it confusing. So, kudos to all of you who try to make this process simple and clear for the kids, because they really do need it. So let me see if I'll try to share the screen here. I think that's the one. Wait, sorry. There's always this awkward thing where the presenter's talking to him or herself, trying to get this thing going. All right. Can you see this PowerPoint file?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm going to put it in slide share mode. Okay. So I'm just going to start with an overview of our advocacy framework. And what I like to do with these is give you some of the background on how we get to these priorities, because I do think sometimes if you just throw the priorities up there, it leaves the question, well, who determines this? Why is my association advocating on these things? So I do want to provide you with a little bit of background on that, and then walk you through what our advocacy framework is right now. And while it is focused primarily nationally, the beauty of it is that it can be applied at any level. So whether it's a federal issue, a state issue, or a local issue even, these are framing sort of principles that we hope will allow us to address a whole range of issues. And we do address a whole range of issues, even just here in DC, but also in working with affiliates. So as I go through it, I would encourage you, if you have any questions. I think I can see everybody still. So, raise your hand, interrupt, whatever you need to do. I think the one thing that I'm not going to see as well is the chat. So if you do have questions, I encourage you to jump in. And as I get into the presentation, I think one of the most important things that I always try to emphasize is that you are the expert in this conversation. I've been doing this policy work for, let's see, close to 30 years now, including the 22 with NACAC. And I think one thing one disconnect that a lot of people have about their elected officials, whether they're at the state or the national level, is that somehow they or their staff are going to know a lot more than we do on some level about a whole lot of things. But the fact of the matter is they know a lot about the individual environment in which they're working. They know a lot about the process, how many votes it takes to invoke cloture, all these obscure things that we don't typically talk about at our social gatherings. But what they don't know about is our profession. They don't know what we do every single day. And more importantly, they don't know the challenges that we face. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting and I've mentioned a student to counselor ratio and had lawmakers or their staff's jaw just drop and hit the desk because they just don't even know what it's like to be a school counselor, to be a college admission officer, to see the challenges firsthand. And so you're bringing that experience to the conversation. It makes you the expert. So, as you talk with policymakers or their staff over the course of a year, they might throw out questions about data points or about, any sort of question that might go beyond your day-to-day experience. And that's what we're here for at NACAC, that if you get questions like that from legislators, or you're thinking about it and you just want to know these issues and this, some sort of more in-depth knowledge of an issue, that's something that NACAC can help with. So as we go into this, I'll just start with that and make sure that you all know that part of what makes any political system work is that it relies on people who are not sitting in the state or federal capital to be able to articulate what their challenges are. And that's I think a really important thing. And it always causes me to take a moment to thank you for being willing to step out of your daily grind, which I know is a grind. I mean, you were talking about COVID just a minute ago. I don't think I've ever been busier in the 30 years I've been in the workforce than I am right now. And I think we have COVID to thank for that, among other things, of course. So thank you very much for being willing to take time to advocate with SACAC and with NACAC. So to start the presentation, I'm just going to go through, Megan's seen this presentation about 6 or 7 times now, so you could probably do this as well. But I'm going to kind of speed through some of it so that we can talk a little bit more conversationally. I do want to note right up front that our advocacy efforts are grounded in our core values. And our core values, in turn, are grounded in our guide to ethical practice in college admission, which for those of you who've been around a while, this used to be called a statement of principles of good practice, and more recently, the code of ethics for professional practice. And we used to enforce it. People could submit complaints to NACAC and we would adjudicate them and go back. And if the institution or school that had been complained about was in violation, we could actually ask them to come back into compliance. This is now a best practices document, thanks to a Department of Justice antitrust inquiry that NACAC went through for about 3 years. So a lot of it reads the same as it did when it was enforceable, except that now it's couched in best practice language. But really, this is the reason NACAC exists. Back in 1937, this is why we were formed. It was colleges getting together to figure out how we could agree upon some ground rules to make the college admission process a little more transparent, a little more aligned, so that students weren't having to apply, through 17 different processes and deadlines and things like that. So the core values that you see listed there on the left: education, access and equity, professionalism, collegiality, trust, and social responsibility. You'll find those sort of woven throughout all of our priorities. And I think even on the ones that seem to be a little more individually focused, like professionalism, collegiality, trust, those actually come into play. We look at social responsibility, access and equity, and of course, education, and we see, oh, of course, we're going to advocate for those things on a grand scale. And I think the other 3 are a little less intuitive, but they're also important. You think about professionalism, you think about what I just talked about, which is we as a profession know what we're doing. We have a base of knowledge. We have data. We have all sorts of different information that can be brought to bear on this process. So while it means one thing in the individual context, for me on the advocacy level, it means that we're going to bring our the full sort of weight of knowledge and experience that we have to this advocacy equation. And so with that in mind, that's where all of our advocacy sort of is grounded. We move on then here in 2019, 2020, NACAC convened an ad hoc committee on leadership in college admission. And that group really sort of laid down a set of markers for us to think about how we operate as an association moving forward. And it was very much grounded in that guide to ethical practice, in our history as NACAC. And what it did was it gave us some really overarching principles. And I've included a link here. I'll send the PowerPoint to you after, so you can read this if you'd like. This is just kind of a roadmap for if we acted on our principles as NACAC, and we wanted sort of to achieve the goals that we've always sort of cared about, which is, how do we improve access and equity in post-secondary education, and how do we make that transition more inclusive, more fair, more equitable? These 6 principles here are things that we agreed on as a committee would really need to be front and center. And so you'll see a lot of familiar things here. Redesigning college admission policy and practice to make sure that students' interests are front and center. That's been the core of our ethical principles since day one, and it's something we fully anticipate continuing. Again, you'll see transparency there being really important. That too was included in the guide to ethical practice. We also started introducing this notion of higher education as a public good. And what that means is that, it doesn't just convey benefits to the individual. You as a student go to higher education, and yes, you get a degree, you get experiences that will last you a lifetime. You'll get skills and knowledge that will help you enter life, really, the workforce, yes, but also other aspects of your life. But what rarely gets talked about when it's in the policy context is how much good higher education does for society as a whole. We've seen there's research out there that shows that along with sort of the employment implications, you have a growing tax base, you have growing innovation, so you have economic well-being that benefits a lot more people than just the one person that went to college. You also have engagement in the democracy. You have greater levels of efficacy and engagement in public, like things like public participation, things like voting and attending, board meetings and advocating and things like that. There's all sorts of ways in which the democracy becomes stronger. There's also ways in which we save money elsewhere. So more investments in higher education have been linked to less spending on things like the social welfare net, the incarceration. There's all sorts of different ways in which when you spend more on education, other areas start to go down. And hopefully that would continue into the future. And we really feel like our public funding mechanisms have actually gone in the opposite direction. We started out in the 60s with the Higher Education Act. And really the premise for that was no student should be prohibited from attending college because of their family income. And the Pell Grant was originally envisioned as a grant that would allow a student to attend 4 years of a public higher education anywhere in the country. As more students have come into the higher education system, as we've recognized advances in civil rights, in women's rights, more people have flooded into this system. Policymakers have been less willing to sort of carry out that promise. And what's happened is we've started to treat higher education less like a public good on that level, and we shifted the burden to individual students and families in the form of loans. So that now access and equity are further threatened because students have to bear more of the burdens. States and the federal government are actually paying less per capita than they were in the 60s for students to attend college. Even though the real dollar amounts have increased exponentially, it is much harder for students to afford because of the number of students who are now able to go. So we want to make sure that we think about the public policy context of this, and we want to make sure that everybody knows that access to education, both K-12 and higher ed, produce great benefits for the public at large, not just the individuals, and we want to fund it that way. So protecting students' rights, and then, as I said, fully funding higher education. Those are some big overarching principles that guide our advocacy. And that's important because every once in a while, we'll get inquiries from members of Congress to say, will you support this bill? And of course, David Hawkins sitting here at NACAC can't unilaterally make that decision. I need the backing of our members and our board. I need, I have to have my decisions grounded in something. And so this helps me narrow the field a little bit. It kind of keeps out things like, would you like to support our bill for, I don't know, agriculture or military spending? There's things that I can sort of filter out thanks to this this framework. You may or may not have seen in November of 2021, our board approved a direction that shifts us ever so slightly from our prior direction. For a long time, we had what I called a three-legged stool that supported our public policy efforts, and that really was very sort of clear from a professional standpoint, which we supported equitable access to rigorous curriculum to prepare students for college, because we know that there were inequities in that space. We wanted equitable access to school counselors, which we all know from student to counselor ratios we don't have right now. And we wanted vigorous support for need-based financial aid. So we're still going to support all of that, but what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of reframe it a little bit. And this work is actually currently ongoing. So for those of you that are interested in NACAC's advocacy work, there will be plenty of opportunities to engage with us. So stay tuned for more. But the way we're going to really sort of look at our advocacy now is that we're going to take a similar approach, that we need to lead where our experience is strongest. And so we want to talk about first and foremost, student and equity-centered admissions practices. Because student-centered practice has been our reason for being thanks to that guide to ethical practices. And since equity has been such a part of our advocacy for so many years, we feel like looking at the admissions issues that we face through those lenses will help us get to a point where we're leading in this area, where we're not just simply being asked to sign on by other organizations, that we're actually creating the opportunities for people to support initiatives that we've come up with. Similarly, now that we have a set of ethical practices that is best practices rather than enforceable, we need to look at the way we talk about our ethics differently. We need to think about advocating for these ethical principles rather than enforcing them. I always go to the example of when the government instituted seatbelt laws in each state. You can't really pull over every driver and to check to see if their seatbelt is on. But what you can do is you can create an advocacy campaign. You can create a communications campaign and let people know, fastening your seatbelt, yes, it's the law, but B, here's why it's important. You don't want your face through the windshield. That's why it's important. So that's something we want to start engaging on through our advocacy, to make sure that people understand that our ethical principles are still there. We still think they're really important, and there are real reasons why they're there, but we just need to make sure that we're not enforcing them anymore so we don't get in trouble with the Department of Justice. And then the third area where we want to lead is the advocacy for school counselors and college advising. We've done that for a long time, and we're going to continue to do that. So those are the three areas where we really want to be front and center. We want our expertise on the table. And as you'll see in a later slide, we're going to continue to advocate for other things, but they'll just be on a different level. So to give you an example of how our student and equity-centered admission practices will play out, I've got a picture of the Supreme Court here. I think everybody probably knows by now that the Supreme Court is going to take up the combined Harvard University and University of North Carolina cases. We are going to be hard at work to advocate before the court by submitting an amicus brief, which allows us to state our case to the court as a friend of the court, even though we're not a party to the case. So we're going to be joining likely with a lot of the other admissions organizations like ACRO. I believe College Board will be there. The Law School Admissions Council will be there. We're going to try to do a great deal more advocacy to ensure, well, it's really to advocate on behalf of the University of North Carolina and Harvard in their defense. But what we also want to do is, if you've watched these court cases over the years, you've seen that the legal grounds for considering race and ethnicity in admissions has substantially narrowed over the years. And so while we want to continue to fight to preserve the grounds upon which we can consider race and ethnicity as a factor among factors in the admissions process, we at NACAC also want to just really blow out the playing field here, because these court cases are focused on one very narrow part of the admissions process. We want to be in the business of digging up everything we do, if you've seen Apollo 13 before, you take apart the machine, you blow on every piece of it to figure out how to make sure that it's working to its appropriate end. That's the approach we want to take through our advocacy with equity. And so we really want to develop a research base. We want to develop a clearinghouse. So that's all in the future. But one thing I wanted to point out, if you haven't already seen it, and I realize I didn't put the link to this in this slide, but I'll send it around. This is a report we recently put out with the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, in which we actually go through and look at every aspect of the admissions and recruitment process. And we talk about how we could start conversations on campuses and with NACAC and our affiliates about each piece of what we do. How is each of it affected by equity considerations? Really, as we did the report, it was an eye-opening sort of thing. We had a lot of really great people on a panel that we had advising us. And it was amazing how difficult it was for us to lift ourselves out of our day-to-day experience to really think about the big picture. And one example is we were talking about which part of this? This was rethinking the application process. And someone in the group started talking about there ought to be a class for students to learn about the college admissions process. And of course, I'm sitting here as a staff person trying to keep a straight face and mouth shut and thinking, okay, all right, well, those exist, but it's also sort of putting the burden on students rather than looking at the system, right? So we've got the lens sort of the wrong way. And then someone said, well, I think that class ought to start in freshman year. I know we know some schools have it in the junior or senior. That ought to start freshman year. And I started to think, okay, now we're doubling down on sort of expecting the students to conform to the system rather than the other way around. And then someone said, well, it really should start as early as kindergarten. And that's where I had to jump in. I thought, okay, hang on. I said, this is a great example of, do we need to look at this somewhat differently? Because we're talking about having students learn about the college application process, which occupies a several month period of their lives. We're talking about having them learn about that for as long as they're learning math. I said, do we need to right size this conversation a little more? And so that kind of caused the group to pivot and start looking at, well, geez, what if the admissions process was different? What if the application process itself was different? What if a student could go online through their high school and click on the schools that they were interested in, and that automatically sent transcripts, demographic information, contact information, and that's the application, right? That's the kind of thinking that we were looking for. We were like, okay, this is where we need to think. How do we make this process easier and shift the burden from the students back towards the places where I think, are better able to handle it? Where you have the school with so much information, the colleges with a lot of capacity. Why not let them talk to each other on the students' behalf and make that more equitable? So that's just one small example. But this report really lays the groundwork for where we want to go on this priority in the future. So if you haven't seen it already, take a look at it. We'll be doing a lot more from NACAC on this. This ethics priority is our second major focus. And as I said earlier, we really want to focus on 3 different areas of work here. We want to educate practitioners because we know there's a lot of people who come into the profession, they're new. I know a lot of professionals aren't familiar with NACAC. There's a lot of folks who aren't even in NACAC. So we want to make sure that we're educating people on what these principles actually are, because we can't just hang this out on our website and expect people to come read it. We also feel like we have to communicate why these standards are important to not just professionals, but also the public, policymakers, media. the May 1st deadline is something that a lot of people know about, especially if you've gone through the process. Pretty much everybody knows about it, but not everybody knows that that was a NACAC principle that is contained in this document. And without an enforceable sort of mechanism here, we could see colleges start to depart from that May 1st deadline, and then it becomes kind of a free-for-all. And what does that do for students? So we need to figure out how to communicate effectively, not just what our principles are, but why they matter and why they matter to the stakeholders that need them in the moment. And then finally, we would be looking for opportunities to advocate for public policies that emphasize ethics in the transition. And that's one of the areas where over time, we've had a lot of activity with respect to for-profit colleges. I don't know if you all have read about the sort of scandals that have gone on over the last 10 years, which really actually extend back more than 50 years if you look into the history of it. But there's a lot of unsavory predatory recruitment that goes on in the for-profit sector, and we don't have for-profit members as members of NACAC, but we do watch that debate very carefully and have been involved in a lot of congressional action. We've been called to testify. We've written legislation or helped draft legislation to protect students from predatory recruitment. So that's the kind of issues that would fall into this area that all sort of stem from that guide to ethical practice in college admission. And then finally, for our big priorities, we're going to want to look at, again, supporting school counselors and college advisors. This map is got data that's a couple of years old, and I'll try to get you guys more updated data, but just wanted you to see the visual here. This is a map of school districts in Alabama, and the color coding is that in the greenish areas, you have the lower student to counselor ratios, and in the reddish areas, you have the higher student to counselor ratios. So it goes sort of green is better ratios, yellow through to darker yellow, sort of a little bit worse, and then the reddish ones are the dark red are 500 students per counselor or greater. So we can get you a spreadsheet that has the updated information per school district. But I just found that when we talk about national student to counselor ratios, you get a number like 460 to 1. Of course, the recommended ratio is 250 students per counselor. And then you look at state ratios, and in Alabama, I didn't put it on this slide, but you get a ratio of somewhere in the 450 to 1 range. But even that doesn't do justice to what the student to counselor ratio is in different areas of the state. And I think you see here, there are just areas where you have some areas are urban areas, other areas are rural areas that have these deep red colorings, and it just shows that even if a state is doing better, you still have to look within the state at the district level. And I find that this kind of data is helpful when you're talking to policymakers to be able to say, look, the state may be doing okay, but look at those counties in red. Don't we want to help those counties or those districts? And I did provide a link to where this map is located on the website, so that'll be in the presentation as well. So, and again, you see those 3 areas: admissions, counseling, ethics. That's what NACAC is all about, and that's where we want to lead going into the future. Now, that said, there are some really important things that we're going to continue to advocate for. We're going to continue to advocate for college affordability because it's all about the dollars and cents. And without it, it just, no policy platform is complete without it. Student protections against fraud and abuse. Again, there's a lot outside of the recruiting process that predatory colleges have manipulated. So we're going to continue to advocate there. DACA and DREAM Act, we're going to continue to advocate for undocumented students. Global student mobility with a growing international population, international mobility, not just from international locations to the US, but really all over the world. We want, there's a lot of US students now traveling abroad for higher education. So we're going to continue to advocate for minimal barriers to student mobility. And then, of course, transfer pathways and other forms of education. We need to make sure that what is now a minority sort of experience, which is the straight from high school to 4-year education, is seen appropriately in the context of the way so many more people are getting into higher education nowadays. We want to make sure that we're attuned to all of that, conversation. And then this is my last slide. This is because we are a little bit short-staffed at NACAC right now. I think that COVID hit us just like it hit everybody else. And so we're trying to funnel information through our NACAC bulletin, but also through the NACAC wonk. That's the Twitter feed that I manage. And you can see it's got my glasses right there. But I try to put up to the minute information out there, and that's a pretty good way to see what we're up to here at NACAC. So with that in mind, I think that's the end of my slideshow, and I realize we're about half hour in. I'm happy to just kind of stop and have a conversation, because there are a lot of issues that are happening here in DC right now that I'm happy to update you on. So before I do that, are there any questions about what we've talked about so far?
Sorry, David, I accidentally hit my Windows button, not my mute button. So first of all, just curious, does wonk stand for anything?
Wonk. Wonk is a word that has come to describe people who are deep into policy issues. Okay. So policy wonk is a phrase you'll hear a lot around legislative circles. So here's a little known fact about NACAC. I had a Twitter feed, a policy Twitter feed, before NACAC had its actual feed. I was an early adopter of Twitter, and it used to be called Hawkins NACAC, because I didn't really know what to name it, and sure, NACAC didn't have a feed. So I thought, okay, I want them to know it's not me and not actually NACAC full on. Right. But we changed it to NACAC wonk because I wanted the feed to survive beyond me if I were to step out and sure, walk into the path of a bus. So anyway, that's what wonk is.
Gotcha. Great. Awesome. Just a little curiosity on my part there. Second question I had too, just in light of all the seismic changes our world has gone under these past 2 years, I mean, have you guys seen, as far as just your organizational advocacy and lobbying, any potential issues that maybe were not getting as much attention prior to the pandemic, starting to receive more attention, whether it be related to that equitable, admissions process, or especially funding, since that's been, as far as funding or just student debt, that's been a major focus for our nation.
Yeah, what's really fascinating about pre and post COVID is that heading into COVID, a lot of the talk in higher ed policy circles, frankly, was stagnant. Congress is responsible for reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, which contains all of the rules and laws and financial aid programs that we know and love, and they haven't fully reauthorized it since 1998, since before I started work with NACAC. So that gives you some sense of, they've done it piece by piece, and they've renewed programs and stuff. It's not that the programs have gone away, but they just aren't exercising a lot of tight oversight over higher education, and they really haven't done a lot of work to really refresh the federal perspective on it. So a lot of what was being talked about were small things, and one of those things, in fact, was it directly stemmed from our own involvement with the Department of Justice. People were wondering, geez, we have varsity blues in the not so distant past. This is, again, pre-COVID, so it was really in the not so distant past. And then we have this situation where NACAC, which has really kind of held down a self-enforcing role for the profession, is now sort of been taken out of the picture when it comes to enforcement. So a lot of people were really worried if colleges were going to go out and just have a free-for-all and be like, you have to commit within 2 weeks of getting your acceptance letter, or we're going to offer you incentives, financial incentives that we couldn't offer before. People were really worried that it was going to be the Wild West in higher ed. And a lot of these other issues, I think, save for the Supreme Court issue, because those lawsuits were starting to percolate prior to COVID. The landscape was really pretty dry, but I'll tell you this, COVID had a way of energizing a lot of issues. So a lot of things are now on the radar screen, that really weren't prior to COVID. So, Biden's State of the Union address mentioned he's going to propose $1 billion to hire school counselors and school psychologists. And while that is more on a mental health angle, we'll take school counselors wherever we can get them. We love that. We love those kind of proposals. So that stuff just was not, you could not have, I would not have predicted that something like that would be talked about in the State of the Union address, no less. I think also that downward trajectory that I mentioned about state funding and federal funding kind of per capita being on the decline, that's pretty much reversed itself now. I think folks are realizing, wow, we've kind of let the ball drop on that. And I think there's interest in a state and federal partnership to try to rectify that, because obviously the federal government can't do it by itself, and we can't expect states to do it by themselves. So there's got to be a partnership there. And then the last thing I'll mention to answer that question is, there was a change of administrations pre and post COVID. That made all the difference in the world, because during the previous administration, I think we found ourselves playing a lot more defense. And ideally, we'd like to be playing a lot more offense to be able to advance our principles rather than defending against principles that we feel are harmful. And so, the conversation really, as it does between administrations, oftentimes it really turns overnight. We went from fighting to keep, DACA students in the legal pipeline to then all of a sudden having a Congress and a president that was really willing to invest more in undocumented students. And it was like that on pretty much every issue. So that's really one of the most significant changes. So now pretty much everything's on the table, which is great, but it just means we have to be active on many, many fronts.
Well, and kind of in light of that activity too, I mean, how do you balance the gymnastics of the federal lobbying and advocacy rather as opposed to state by state, because educational policy is not just mandated from DC and adopted by every single state without complaint.
Right. No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, it's really important to acknowledge as part of that, the response to that is most education policy making is made in the states. So the majority of K-12 funding and policy is made in the state legislatures, and the majority of higher ed appropriations and policy are made at the states. The only thing that the federal government really does the lion's share of is need-based financial aid for post-secondary education. So the student loan programs and the Pell Grant. What we try to do here is we try to monitor as much state legislation as we can. We have a system through Bloomberg Government that kicks out bills that have keywords in it, that match up with our interests. And what we really do is we really rely on the affiliate networks to kind of help advise us. Oftentimes, the affiliate networks are the ones that flag the legislation because they see it first, and they come to us and say, oh my gosh, this bill, it's either excellent or it's awful. Can you help us with something? And in those instances, I will say absolutely. We can deploy anything from letter writing to action alerts to meetings. We can do all sorts of things to help support the affiliate networks in getting those points across. And then there are sometimes when bills will come through because, frankly, legislators stuff provisions into all sorts of different bills. It's kind of like needle in a haystack sometimes. But if we see something, we will sort of turn around and say, ooh, have you seen this? If yes, fine. If not, what do you think? And that's kind of how we manage that. So in addition to thanking you all for being willing to take the time to advocate, I also have to thank you for also serving as an extension of our government relations and advocacy efforts here, because there's so much work going on out there that it's such a help. It was so heartwarming for me to know there's so many people who care and who can help us direct our efforts accordingly.
Well, if you would, could you tell us a little bit more about any kind of specific legislation you all are focusing on right now? During the session.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the first thing that we work on is education appropriations. We just want to make sure this is a bread and butter thing that we just want to make sure the programs that are on the books now get the money that we think they should get. So things like TRIO and Gear Up, college access programs, what we call the Title 4A program, which is that's a very wonky thing to say, by the way, to refer to something by its statutory. So Title 4A is just a wonkies for this block grant that gets given to states every year. And in that block grant, there are several provisions that could benefit college admission counseling, which is you can use some of the states could use some of that money to hire school counselors. They could use it to do college awareness activities for students. So that's another type of funding mechanism that we want to make sure gets enough money to make a difference. Pell Grants, student loan, we want to make sure all that's taken care of. So that's number one. Obviously, with the Biden administration's State of the Union, he's put some things on the table. So in addition to the school counselor money, he also suggested raising the Pell Grant by $2,000. And we would certainly support that. So we're going to work on that. We actually are a part of a coalition that wants to double the Pell Grant. So we're also working those channels to try to make sure that we can, we want to achieve what's achievable, but we also want to set the bar pretty high because we do think that the Pell Grant is in bad need of doubling. So let's see what else is on my list. We've had staff reach out to us about several things. One bill that's been introduced recently would ban legacy and donor relations consideration in admissions. And we chose to express sort of a neutral stance on that bill because there's some in the Wonka sphere, there's a couple of considerations. There's a big consideration, and there's kind of a wonky consideration. The wonky consideration is that the bill just isn't written very tightly. It's a very blunt sort of instrument that doesn't really give us any guidelines about how institutions would prove that they didn't consider these things. So take, for example, an institution that admits a class of students and 1/4 of that class has students of our children of alumni in it. Someone might look at that data on the back end and go, look at that, fully 1/4 of that institution's enrolled student body are children of alumni. There's no way in the bill for the federal government to differentiate whether the college actually did that on purpose or if it was just a complete accident that their applicant pool was just full of children of alumni, which could happen. I mean, it does happen. So that's the wonky sort of area. The other area that's a little bit bigger is that we've spent decades arguing before the Supreme Court that colleges and universities have a right to admit students based on the criteria that they set at an institutional level. And it's a constitutional, it's got a tie to the constitutional right of freedom of speech for institutions. It's a long story, but long story made short, on the one hand, we're asking the Supreme Court to allow admissions officers to use their professional judgment, I'll borrow a financial aid term, to handle the concept of race and ethnicity in a way that makes sense in the institutional context. In other words, please don't tell us we can't consider this because we'll do it responsibly. On the other hand, it would be difficult for us to say, but don't let us try to consider legacies and donor status because we're not capable of doing that. So there's a bit of a chess match going on at the policy level. It makes it difficult for us to weigh in and say, oh yeah, definitely ban that thing over there, but don't ban this thing over here. So what we're trying to do with Congress is to help them sort of, if they want to know more about it, let's gather more data. If they want to, let states do, because several states have banned legacy admission for public colleges. And in the public context, it might make a little more sense to actually just limit it. But in a private college, is it the same question? And that's where it just gets really murky really quickly. So that particular bill, we've stayed neutral on. Beyond that, it's, a lot of what we've been doing, congressional staff will reach out to us and say, what do you think of this? And I think that's something that as you get into advocacy more, you'll experience more. But one thing that they called us on recently, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee called us to ask us about this antitrust lawsuit that's been filed against the institutions that collaborate on financial aid, the 568 group. That's another wonky kind of thing. I don't know if you've all seen this lawsuit, but it certainly attracted the attention of Capitol Hill. Basically, there's a group of institutions, private institutions, that way back in the 80s had been collaborating on financial aid issues. Namely, they were using sort of a a common methodology among the institutions for financial aid, and they were comparing notes on which students they had admitted and which they were thinking about giving aid to, so that what would happen is rather than all of the institutions issuing aid sort of helter-skelter, they were saying, well, how about if I issue a full ride to this set of students who also were admitted to your institution, you issue the full ride to this other set of students that were also admitted to mine. And so there was a little bit of collaboration going on there. And they had earned an exemption. They had been sued by the Reagan administration for antitrust law violation. The logic was students could get better offers if you weren't collaborating. And the institution said, no, actually students would get, on the whole, worse offers if we weren't collaborating. So Congress gave them an exemption many years ago that was predicated on them meeting certain criteria. And one of those criteria was that they be need blind in all of their admissions. Well, fast forward to this year, that exception was put into law in the late 80s. Fast forward to this year, a group of students and some had enlisted some attorneys who in turn sued this group of colleges, not necessarily for the antitrust issue itself, but for violating the provisions that allowed them to have the antitrust exemption. And specifically, they said, you're not need blind throughout your entire process. So that's a really long story, but it all comes down to whether an institution actually, when it says it's need blind, whether it's actually need blind. And the allegations they made, which I can't say whether or not they're 100% accurate or not, because we haven't yet heard from the institutions. But they were saying things like, we see on your website, you have a blog that says you're need aware during the waitlist process, which a lot of colleges are. But because these groups have that antitrust exemption, if they are in fact need aware in the waitlist process, it might jeopardize their protection under the antitrust statute. And I realized that was a really jargon-filled explanation. Bottom line, Congress was asking us, staff or members of Congress were asking us here at NACAC, should we get involved in that? And of course, my answer was no at this point, because we haven't yet heard from the colleges. We don't know how the judge would rule. There's just so many things that are out there that we don't know that I would suggest you not get involved. But that's the kind of thing, when you start meeting with legislators, once you get on their Rolodex, once they figure out, oh, this person knows something about college admission, you probably start getting calls, hey, there's this bill to make the FAFSA mandatory in my state. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You just start coming up with questions, and that just sort of reinforces itself, because the better answers and the more answers you provide, the more that relationship reinforces itself.
Well, David, thank you so much for that overview. Really, my only other question for you is, what can we do in order to better help NACAC advocacy efforts? How can we get involved? Are there any specific dates or specific initiatives coming up that anyone can be a part of if they are a member?
Yeah, first thing is, again, I think getting plugged in. So if you go to the NACAC website, there's an advocacy section up on the top menu bar. Go and peruse that. Take a look through that and see what's there. The wonk, engaging with the wonk, that's really a good thing to do on Twitter. Again, we try to get as much stuff out there as we can on a pretty timely basis. Reading the NACAC bulletin is another great way of staying informed about what we're doing. In terms of opportunities to get involved, earlier I mentioned that we were undergoing this advocacy overhaul. We are going to start reaching out to folks, opportunities to comment, to provide input. So stay tuned for those. That'll be a really good way to get involved. Doing what you're doing now is a terrific way to get involved, because once we get this advocacy framework finalized and put some details into it, we're going to then want to start moving out to the affiliates and talking about how we can do things to support this agenda at the state level. And that's where, in the past, we've done things like drafted state legislation that you guys can carry out to the state and start meeting with folks and start advocating for. And of course, we would talk to you about, geez, under this umbrella, what are the policies that make most sense for you in Alabama? Wouldn't be a thing where we're just sending you stuff and saying, here, go and do this. But that's the kind of thing. So that is under construction right now. And once we get that up and running, you'll see more opportunities coming down the line.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time today. And I can personally say this was very enlightening and very, very edifying. So thank you so much.
Well, great. Well, thanks for having me. And I realize this can be kind of thick. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'll send you the PowerPoint, and happy to follow up at any time.
Legislative policy is thick? No, I've never heard that. No, absolutely not. Thank you so much. For those of you guys who are on the call with us, our last speaker is Representative Terry Collins, I guess Miss too, but Rep Collins has not joined us just yet. I realize we've been on this call for almost 2 hours now. So what I want to do is I want to take a quick 5-minute break and wait for her to come in, and then we will get started here at roughly about 10:58, if that is okay with everyone. Everyone good with that? Cool. Awesome. I will go ahead and just put on a nice little slide here, and I'll see you all in about 5 minutes. All right, everyone. I believe we are ready to start again. And so once again, thank you guys for joining us. I've started the recording back as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that break slide. And so I believe we have Representative Terry Collins joining us on the Zoom chat as well. Yes, there you are.
Yes, I do. Yes, you do. Just left one meeting and late for another, but I'm glad to be with y'all. Yes.
Well, we appreciate you joining us today. So Representative Collins, just so you know, we currently have representatives from UAB, Auburn, as well as Vestavia Hills High School on here.
Okay.
Advocacy Day, basically, we've just been going over national advocacy as well as, state advocacy, and then talking about issues that have been affecting higher education, both on the student side as well as the staff side. And so we really wanted to end our day by hearing from you about just policy updates as far as state initiatives are concerned. So,
well, and I'm glad to do that. Is there any particular thing you want to hear about before I just talk about several things you may not?
Well, really, just kind of interested in the legislative agenda for this session as far as any kind of educational policies are concerned. I know Literacy Act is one of the key things you've been working on here for a while, but particularly anything that might relate to higher education, post-secondary opportunities, anything like that would be great as well.
Okay. I think today on the House floor, we should have the budget, which I think is good for everybody. So, in a time of lots of funding available, it makes everybody happy with budget times. So that was a good thing. I think higher ed are all pleased with that as well. We had a certification bill that opened up some alternative certification process for teachers because we're trying to recruit teachers so much. And it's like all professions, it's just hard to find employees right now. But the higher ed had some concerns about that, but I think we listened, we sat down, we met with everybody, and I believe they've kind of worked out all of that, making sure that anything alternative groups could do, they could also do. So I think that's been a good thing, but making sure we can recruit teachers and get them quicker into the workforce. That's kind of our goal on that one. Literacy Act, I have literacy changes that we kind of learned were needed, and it's through Senate committee, should be on the Senate floor. I hope maybe even this week.
Yeah.
And then Senator Smitherman felt very strongly about a delay. Now, I had wanted a 1 year and he wants a 2 year, but his bill has moved through my committee. So they're kind of traveling. It'd be two different bills, but it would be about the same Literacy Act, which, just to let you know, is definitely working. One of the, as I looked at the data, it focuses the Literacy Act on that bottom 5% with some additional benefits. And that's about 52 schools, the bottom 5% of literacy. Even during COVID, when we tested last spring, 37 of those 52 moved out of the bottom 5%. So it's working even now. So that's the good news. Higher education. I think the other thing that I would mention in my committee today, we'll have the Numeracy Act, Senator Orr's, and it's going to kind of let us have a focus like we do on literacy, on math. And since we've seen what we're doing on literacy is working, it gives me a lot of hope that we can make the same changes and be successful as we focus on math. And that also will affect higher education, because some of our literacy and our foundational math skills we are learning, we have got to have a better foundation being taught as they come through the colleges of education. And so that also affects higher ed. So those are the big issues that I think are going on. I'm trying to remember if I've heard anything else as far as the higher ed. I know at first we talked a lot about critical race theory, and I definitely heard more from my higher education people than any of the other groups. It had been in my committee, and I actually had invited people for what I called a discussion. And so we had a professor from Alabama, a professor from Auburn, and then a AIE, an online group of education reform. He was a speaker about it as well, conservative group, but both Republicans and Democrats were in there, and it was really good. I had several from both parties say, well, I'm so glad we've talked about this. I understand the other side's issues better than I had. But then the bill got moved to another committee, so I don't know what's going on with it right now.
Gotcha. Well, kind of rewinding back just a little bit, you mentioned the teacher shortage specifically. I know that's one thing we had on our docket to discuss in our hour-long discussion this morning. I'm a little curious, what steps has the legislator taken to address that specifically?
We several. And so several years ago, the department put together a group, and we actually implemented, even at that time, several of their recommendations. This year, I think we have some bills. Right now, once you're already collecting your retirement, we're not wanting to encourage what they would call double dipping, so that you're getting a salary from the state and your retirement from the state. But there are ways to modify that so you could come back into the workforce and not lose your retirement. And so we've got some bills that are working through on that. And I think that would be helpful because it is critical. We're needing it. Last year, we passed the TEAMS Act. I don't know if you remember that, but it actually gives a $5,000 bonus on top of the salary matrix if you are teaching a STEM class, math, science, engineering, technology. If you're national board certified, you have an additional $5,000. If you're in a hard to teach area, anyway, you could get an additional $15,000 to $20,000 on top of your salary. And so that caused a lot of stir within the state to start with, and we knew it would, but it's actually designed to help us recruit from outside the state as well. And so I believe it's going really, really well. The other thing I would mention is that I served on an SREB, Southern Regional Educational Board roundtable, teacher quantity and quality. I called it TQ square. But we came up with a plan that's been very similar to what North Carolina has done. So you create really a career pathway for teachers, so that maybe even as young as high school, you could be working on a pre-apprenticeship towards teaching and get your foot in the door and see if you like it. And then possibly even get paid at a much reduced, but more than zero. And then you would work along, and some of that money for that teacher unit would go to give an additional bonus to a mentor or a coach who's working with that new teacher. Do you see what I'm saying? So you'd use the same amount of money, but you'd use it more creatively, creating a teacher pathway. So that if you're a really great teacher in the classroom, in order to make more money, you don't have to go into administration. You could stay in the classroom and use your skills with your students still, but also help and prepare other teachers to be good teachers. So I think that's not what we're going to do this year, but it's a great plan, and it's still on that back burner. And maybe by next year, we'll be ready to do that.
Interesting. That's a creative solution.
We were very excited. And as SREB was leading it, they were also working with North Carolina. And so North Carolina was like a few months ahead of us, but we were both kind of coming to the same place. So they actually kind of shared our ideas and worked together. So having 4 or 5 pilots started and work the kinks out in Alabama, that would be my goal for possibly working on that next year.
Okay, perfect.
Andrew, I have a question for Representative Collins. This is Oliver Aaron at Vestavia Hills High School. Thank you for joining us this morning. Has there been any more discussion, we're talking about teacher retention and teacher recruitment on a tier 3? We have tier 1, we're currently with tier 2 with new employees, but something in the middle where go into a tier 3 where teachers, new educators coming into the field do not have to work the 30 years for retirement. Could you speak for that?
Well, trying to, yes, we've been working on that. Representative Baker has worked on that. Last year, we passed a tier 2 modification that would let your sick leave stay with you. That was an important part about keeping our teachers in the classroom, especially when we need them so badly during those COVID years. But we've tried to find what I would call a sweet spot. I even had RSA run the actuaries just a few weeks ago on, okay, if we do the employee contribution just up like less than 0.5%, it still costs the state a good bit, and that's not making it through the Senate. So I thought, well, let's try to adjust that or balance it. But then it created a higher unfunded liability in the retirement system. So I guess my answer is yes, we're looking at that. We're trying to find a way. Right now, we easily get it through the House every year, and it bogs down in the Senate. And so trying to find that sweet spot so it doesn't hurt the unfunded liability in the insurance program, but it's also a very reasonable employee contribution part. Surely there's some level spot we can find. So that's what we've been working on, but I don't think we're there today.
Well, and then I just have one final question, because I know you've only got about 3 more minutes with us here.
Well, thank you for watching that for me.
Yeah, not a problem, not a problem. So I know one of the things we talked about with our representative from our national organization earlier was about college affordability just across the board, across the nation, and specifically about state funding, how that has been on the downturn since roughly about the 1970s, but since the pandemic has started to change the tide here. So I'm a little curious as to what the state of Alabama is doing as far as making college affordable, whether it be on the 2-year or 4-year track for our students.
Well, I think some of the things that we've done is we continue to try to fund and even raise the money in the dual enrollment so that you start in high school earning both high school and college credits towards a major, making sure that those classes are reciprocal so that when you get that probably community college class, it's acceptable in that college class as well, that 4-year institution. So trying to make that a little bit more seamless has been a big part of it. We have raised money that we give for scholarships, especially for high need scholarships, needs-based scholarships. We are very low in that. I just had some of the city council people from my area and they were asking, so I see the gaming's moving again. And I said, well, we'll see. And while I don't know exactly where I'll be, I'll have to see what that bill does. I've always been a hard no, even on lottery, unless it went to fund higher education scholarships, which kind of tips me over the top because we know we're not doing that at the level we need to. And so that's kind of where we are right now. We continue to try to lift those amounts that are available to try to help students that are in need. I think when the school board passed that seniors have to graduate and fill out the FAFSA, I know Tennessee they get more Pell Grant money than any other state because they require that. Yeah. And so I believe as we continue to work on that, we want to make sure we don't leave any money on the table for our students. And that is something we are doing right now.
Gotcha. Well, Representative Collins, we really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy woman and we do appreciate you being able to hop on.
Well, I'm glad to be here and I'm sorry it's during session and it's so crazy, but I do appreciate it. And if anybody has questions, y'all know how to get in touch with me. You know my email, and I'm happy to respond back with anything you've got questions about. Or if you've got good ideas, share them with me.
For sure. Absolutely.
Thank
you so much.
Okay. Y'all have a good rest of the day.
Absolutely. You as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone, thank you guys so much for joining. I think I personally really enjoyed speaking with our 2 guest speakers today. And also, of course, enjoy speaking with all of you guys. It's good to see y'all's faces, even if it is virtual. And so I really just kind of want to end today by just a couple of reminders. First of all, thank you once again for being part of this. One of the big things about participating in a democracy is conferring with your legislators and people who want to make a difference. That requires a lot of different voices and a lot of different compromise. And so that's one of the reasons why we're here is we want to get those voices. We want to understand what's happening in our world so that way we can make it better for all of us. And additionally, there are going to be plenty of opportunities for us to engage, whether it be through this forum, through SACAC, and through the many different other things going on. And I'll just do another plug for SAI's virtual counselor drive-in on the 15th too. So if you haven't registered for that, do register for that, especially if you're on the college counseling side. And beyond that, Megan, was there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, just that I'd love to see y'all at the conference next month. So if you're there, please come see me. Love to connect face to face.
Great. Well, once again, guys, thank you so much for joining us. And I will look forward to seeing you all here very soon.
Thank you.